Welcome to Quiet Before. I'm very excited to be featuring the story of Ron Kim. We're here today with his closest colleagues that have been with him through this journey. I'm really excited at this point in his career to take stock of how he got to where he is and what it took to get there. We're just going to go ahead and ask everybody to introduce themselves. Yuh-Line, do you want to start?
My name is Yuh-Line Niou. I actually started working with Ron on his very first campaign for state assembly. I became his chief of staff right after, and he was the first to encourage me to run for office.
My name's Tony Tsao, and I'm someone who joined Ron's office in about 2015, summer of 2015, and I gradually assumed different roles there and became chief of staff a few years later, and I've been with him since then.
Hey everyone, Ron Kim here. It's an absolute privilege, and I'm so honored to share this platform with my two very important people who shaped everything about what I am and how I became to be as a public servant in the last 12 years.
What made you want to be a public servant? What made you want to be in elected office? Obviously, hindsight's 2020, so things have shifted a little bit in your memory, I'm sure, and what drove you at first.
The older I get, the more honest I become about these reflections. Initially, just like every other person we know, and we're all human, and I think it was mostly just the big chip on my shoulder, just being part of a marginalized community, an immigrant who felt reduced growing up, seeing your parents getting hated on and seeing them going through so much struggles as a small business owner, as immigrants who didn't speak any English. All those things culminated in a young man with a lot of anger and wanted to show the world that my family are better than this. I think the initial kind of motivations all came from this extrinsic motivation. And then along the way, I developed a different purpose and passion. The moment, as you know, you help someone opens up a whole different perspective on how gratifying and how addictive sometimes it is to get to that outcome of helping another human being. And I think that's what stuck with me as a public servant. I tell myself initially that, I ran because I wanted to help all the people, but I think it was blind narcissism to think that, oh, I can change the world. Looking back on all the stuff that I said running for my office first time, it was a bit naive for me to think that as a local person that I can change so many. And I realized after 12 years, it takes a lot to even move the needle. It takes a lot of patience to change the system.
I think you changed the system a lot, for one. I mean, just like looking from somebody who's close to you, but also in some aspects as somebody who's believed in you for so long. You and I had a conversation, I still remember. It was at an AFI conference when we first were chatting. And
Yeah, talk about that very often. Yeah.
I was just finishing up my National Urban Fellows program, and Ron zeroed in on me. Will you come and be my campaign manager? And I was like, who are you? I had worked in a lot of elected offices already, but you were so excited because I think first off, I was a Mandarin speaker. I was somebody who went through the program that you had gone through, and we obviously connected first thing when we first met. And I think it was a really interesting tell that you intrinsically knew what you were looking for. One of your best assets, as I've seen you, is to pick amazing people to be around you. Not to pat myself on the back, but it was one of those things where I noticed your leadership skills from jump. One of the things that really kind of stuck out for me, and I don't think that it was narcissism or naivete. I think that you really did want to make change. And I think that a lot of that came from your relationship with your parents. That was one of the biggest things when I was actually working on your campaign. One of the things that stuck out the most was how much your family unit was so strong. Your parents were so supportive to the point of where they were driving everywhere, doing everything. And I think that on your end, you saw the little things very clearly that would have made things so different for them. And I think that you also saw how important it was, because you told me from day one, it's the constituents. Constituent service is what matters the most. I guess I just wanted to hit upon some of the moments with your parents first that drove you into public service. I think that it was really your parents' story and how much they sacrificed that was driving you, I think, into public service.
I remember that moment, Pat. the AFI conference, right? It was like the first stab at having our own Asian American conference, right, at NYU. And there's only a few Asian Americans for the National Urban Fellowship Program. And here you are just going being in that space and owning the room and chatting it up and like talking to all the leaders. I'm like, who is this person? Came out of nowhere, like, and knows everyone. I was automatically drawn to your character and personality. I knew in the first split second that you're going to be someone who's going to be a change maker. Going back to your question about my parents, my mom never wanted me to enter the public light. She discouraged it to the very end. And she also never saw me play football. I played football for 10 years from high school to college. Never seen me play football once, never seen me like put on those pads. And she just could never fathom seeing me getting hurt in any kind of way. And she just couldn't see me on the field getting tackled by someone, etc. And I think it was the same thing when I entered public service. She felt like she couldn't provide enough. She was a working mom. She was a cook working at H Mart in the basement. And she felt like we lived in a hyper judgmental community, especially the Korean elites that are, that are always, driven by validations and, what kind of car you drive and what you're a lawyer or your doctor. Those are the questions that drove this community. And they just felt like they couldn't, I would be ashamed of my family and they couldn't give me that backing that they thought that was needed to be in the public spotlight. But the moment that I decided, she did everything she could in her capacity, as well as my dad. And they were all in and they were there every single second. There was a time in the first couple of months of the campaign, we didn't have a car to drive around. And I had to lean in and a supporter to pay I think it was like $800 or something for a used Jeep to drive us around a very old Nissan Pathfinder. I still remember how
I still
smelly
remember
it was.
it too.
And it was my dad. He was working as a home care aide. He was semi-retired, home care attendant, 1199 member working as a home care attendant. And he dropped that to help me drive around the campaign wherever I went. The first time I think I broke down in tears. I've had this periodic meltdowns over the years. I never really talked about it publicly. During that campaign, it was like a Korean support fundraiser. And there was another Korean candidate running against me. I was just under a lot of stress because the Korean candidate was going to drop out supposedly, but he didn't.
Yeah.
So we had a hard time fundraising from the Korean community. And as I was giving this stump speech, as I referred to my dad, things got real emotional, and I just kind of broke down. I don't know why, in front of this room filled with donors. It probably wasn't the best look, and I didn't really connect anything. I just kind of had a meltdown. Those moments helped me define why I was doing it and what was important to me. It made me reflect in the moment with a more clear sense. And I think it was those moments that really drove me and you and others in that campaign to get even more hyper focused. We collectively decided none of that matters, none of the money matters. We can do this on the ground and just going directly to the voters. And it was those type of moments that shifted us to go knock on doors 8 hours a day. That's how we won. That day when we won, it was still surreal. I remember they shielded me in this room. They didn't want me to see the results. Because everyone else was counting the votes, and I was just sitting there. I'm writing 2 speeches, winning, losing, and I remember just praying, oh God, I'm just gonna serve one term, God, just let me just for one term, and then one term turned into 6 terms.
I was still counting all the votes when you went to the venue, and I was finishing up. That's why I was so late into going into your venue that night. You saw me, and then you were like, I can make my speech. And I think that was when things started to kick off for you. What did you feel at that moment? You and I talked a lot about the responsibility you felt all of a sudden. I remember apologizing to you later on when I became an elected person. You remember you telling me about the huge weight, because you were the first Korean American to ever be able to take office anywhere on any level in the state. All of a sudden, all this limelight shined on you in a different way, right? People had expectations that were unreal, and your mom's fears came to play, right? And I think that a lot of that happened almost instantly, right after winning.
Sorry, can I interject? Real
Yeah,
quick,
sure.
Ron, could you go back to when you were on your own and hadn't formed your team? Who were your mentors and how do you feel like you got to the moment that you decided you were going to run? Like, who was part of that decision? How did you go from being on your own to building the team that helped you win?
Before I ran for the state assembly seat, I took a shot at the local city council seat when I turned 30 years old. And that was after the former and the first Asian American to be elected to anything, John Liu, decided he wanted to run for higher office and he vacated the city council seat. Many of us came out of his office, a bunch of cohorts of interns and first time public servants were all coming out, they all came out of office. And eventually, a number of us who came out of office decided to also enter that race. I was probably the youngest person who joined that office last, but internally, I had a lot of support among colleagues and friends that I felt like I had enough of a team to take a shot at it. I didn't know the politics, I didn't know the campaigning and the unions and all these other things that played a role into running for office. I just worked as a staffer and served the people, and I thought I knew the issues and I knew how to serve those constituents, and that was enough. During that experience, I learned a lot about campaigning. Total failure. I didn't even make the ballot. They made an embarrassment out of me, and lobbyists and people came to bully me, to drop out. In a short period of time, I just took in a lot of things and learned a lot. So the next time an opportunity came where a seat had opened in the state assembly, we were in a much better position to put together a better team and to put together the endorsement early, the institutional support, and just playing, I guess, the political game much better. And that's how we were able to win that first race. Obviously, John was in a tough position because he had a lot of people that worked with him trying to vie for that seat. I think he ended up eventually endorsing his chief of staff. There were some ups and downs because as a young person, I was trying to make my pitch to John and he didn't really give me that much time and I felt disappointed. But looking back, I was young. We've come a long way, and the next time there was an opportunity, he was a good mentor and a coach. My first time we ran for that office. So I would say he played a very important role in making me understand the reality of politics, that I need to learn certain things that he had to learn. In terms of like mentorships, I drew my inspiration from my team, starting with like Yuh-Line, and there were others that just showed up and Yuh-Line was able to recruit. And I always wanted to create an environment where they felt they weren't working for me, but we were like equal partners and we had equal ownership of the process. So I drew inspiration from them, and obviously Allison played a very important role because she didn't sign off on it, I wouldn't have run for office. We just got engaged when the seat opened up.
Yeah.
A month before we decided to run, I had proposed to Allison. We had 1 foot out of Flushing already. We were about to sign an extended lease in Manhattan. I was going to take a permanent private sector job to make a living. And I had given up almost on public service and politics. She encouraged me to do it. We gave up on our lease and she decided she never lived in Flushing, but she wanted to make that commitment and move to Flushing with me. I mean, I wish she could work as hard as today as she worked 12 years ago for me, but I'm like a baseball guy. Like if I bet 300, like I'm good. If there's 10 tasks in front of me and our team does 3 out of 10, I'm good. Allison is a 10 for 10, especially on the campaign press release. The tiniest picture in the mailer, like she would get into fights with the campaign manager all the time, like calling him an idiot, like lazy. Yeah, he definitely had like more meltdowns than I did. There was a period when he didn't shower for like 5 days. We had to send him to this Korean Turkish bath in Flushing, and he had no idea what a Korean Turkish bath was.
Oh yeah, I remember this so much because you gave him like a ticket, and he just like went.
Yeah. And he came out just all shocked. Everyone's naked in there.
There were so many men.
Why didn't he bathe for 5 days?
He was on the campaign 24/7, basically. It was really, really amazing to watch everybody just kind of believe in you so much, Ron.
Back to Yuh-Line's question, in terms of the pressure of being the first Korean American elected. How was that for you?
It was kind of surreal. It's almost like a paradox for me because politicians are supposed to be somewhat narcissistic to be effective in a healthy way, but I always felt uncomfortable with the attention, and it was always a struggle for me because at the core, like I'm a introvert. I enjoy like intimate conversations and in one-on-one settings with people that I love and care about, and I draw my energy from smaller groups and people that I trust. And being out there asked to do the retail politics, being propped up, I can perform and I can be theatrical and be good at it and come off as someone who enjoys it, but it was very exhausting. At the end of the day, for the first few years, once a year, I would just break out in hives. Is it eczema? Is it like
Eczema.
from stress? It was just overwhelming. Where after 3 years, I had to really go see a doctor and de-link and pick and choose spaces that I felt comfortable with. Looking back, I think I've embraced it, but it was also stressful. And I also didn't want to be defined just as like the first Korean. So, after a while, we made a conscious choice not to leverage identity politics and be focused on issues that could actually impact not just Korean Americans, but all immigrants. We stopped using rhetoric like going when we get on the stage as as the first Korean American and did this, because we realized at a certain point, maybe Yuh-Line had left and she went into public office herself. But I personally entered the phase where I felt uncomfortable people in power weaponizing my identity to continuate the same broken system. I realized it's always like the establishment that love putting me on a stage and say, see, like we're diverse, like we just elected the first Korean American. I kind of scale back from being used that way and try to really focus on things that could be impactful.
It didn't take away from the burden of the changes, right? I mean, in our office, I still remember we were one of the first to have as many languages as we did, for example, to service constituents. I still remember, because it was the first time that, anybody was servicing constituents in some of the languages that we were using, from Urdu to Mandarin Chinese, especially, the Korean community. They never had constituent services before in a real way. People didn't even know what our office was. I just remember them saying 10A, it's where things get done.
They still do
say
that.
it, right?
Yeah.
We had complaints because of fire code and safety, because we had constituents that would line out the door, out past the elevators. We serviced, I would say, hundreds, which I don't think any assembly office can say as somebody who ran an office. Like, we didn't have hundreds and hundreds of cases a day. And that was something that was happening due to the fact that you were the first Korean American to ever serve. And I think that it was because people saw that there was language access, that there was finally people who were paying attention to the constituent issues on the ground, and that the need was so high.
There's definitely things that we did on the ground that was incredible in terms of giving a sense of not only voice, but for people to walk a little bit prouder, right? To walk tall and say we have representation. Those things did matter. And every time the Koreans felt like a little bit proud, it always impacted my quality of life negatively. Because that means I got recognized more at the supermarket or at the spas, which I do enjoy going from time to time to
Yeah, it's got to be awkward to get a lot handshakes from naked men.
Yeah, I used to enjoy my privacy in the spas to have
Couldn't
all
go to
these
the
naked
YMCA
Korean men.
anymore afterwards.
The YMCA was my favorite pastime. Going to the locker room, there's all these older adults hanging out there naked all day long because we improved the YMCA locker room. There's like a bunch of spas in there. While other politicians love going there, that's not my cup of tea. Jokes aside, it does feel amazing when you have an older adult genuinely like touch you and shake your hand and, said that you did this and I'm so grateful. There's no way to describe that kind of feeling about public service.
People literally did not believe me when I said that we serviced hundreds of people a day in your office. It was actually wild to think about, because I don't think that any other office did that. We were the first office to really kind of do the EITC tax credit work. We were the first office to really kind of do the HEAP translations. And I still remember we were giving the translations that we were making to HEAP. They never had translations, and the language access was such a huge issue. And they said that in our office, we were turning in so many applications applications that, they never had gotten before. And so you could think about all of the benefits that our communities were not receiving due to the fact that we didn't have access because nobody felt comfortable. And when you were talking about like, oh, some people feeling a little bit more like they can walk proudly, it's a huge deal because I think our community always thought about accessing services as some kind of shame or negative. And I think that when we tell them that it's actually their right, it's a whole different thing. You really kind of broke that door and that gate. I think that it really kind of helped our communities in a lot of different ways.
Those are all things that we all feel proud of, but at the same time, after years and years of doing the same thing, you realize like we're getting shortchanged as a community. Like
We are.
we're a legislative office. We're supposed to make laws. Like, why are we
Yeah.
administering the laws that we
Why are we reading
passed
people's mail?
in district,
to
right? In
help them?
district,
Yeah.
in our district office, we're supposed
Yeah.
to source ideas and make policies, not administer those policies. So we're finally at a point where we can push the administration to wake up and say, even though we've had laws, we passed laws to mandate them to have language access, they haven't administered it, right? No
Yeah.
one's enforcing it. But for the first time since you left, we finally passed the AAPI commission in the administrative side, which will be funded. Like, how the Minnesota has an Asian American Commission. I'm hoping, those are incremental steps to actually change the administrative culture and capacity to actually do their job,
Yeah.
instead of relying on legislative offices to administer the laws.
When you were elected, one of your biggest things in pushing was to get the speaker to get us a task force. And I still remember when I was elected, we literally celebrated the forming of the task force in Flushing because you had been asking for it for so long. I actually inherited the data disaggregation bill from you to be able to provide language access, to be able to make it so that we were not seen as a monolithic community. And finally, we're able to ask for different languages across the board. Language access is probably the biggest impact that data disaggregation has when it comes to day-to-day life for a lot of Asian Americans. And I think, you championed that bill for 4 years before I was able to take it on. It was one of the first things that Ron was just like, I'm handing this to you immediately. Because it was like very important to pass and we were able to pass it. But it was something that you had spoke on for years in order to make sure that we had the services because you wanted permanent change. And that was what you were saying, like we're shortchanged and you wanted a permanent change for our communities and having that access.
How did the community know to come to the office? How did that start?
Word of mouth. When it
Yeah,
comes
word of
to
mouth.
when it comes to Asian seniors, I would say that word of mouth was the most powerful thing. Ron and I actually one time we held a housing workshop. It was the first time that we were doing a housing workshop that was providing access to affordable housing. Like we were trying to make sure that they would sign up for New York Connect, etc. It was raining and Ron and I, he was like, I bet you anything we're going to get 30 people at max. And I was like, no, it's going to be over 100. I already told, I like, there were so many grandmas that like came by and had Xeroxed copies of our flyer. It was the first time we were doing something like this. It was a town hall down in the basement of a church. Ron was like, it's raining. The line was around the block, down the street. There were thousands of people. Ron had to go outside and tell them, I'm so sorry, we don't have enough space. It was a packed room. Almost 400 people were in a basement that was only supposed to house 250. The word of mouth of Asian seniors is so powerful. I don't know, Ron.
Sounds like you really put that communication out there.
I will say this, that it wasn't meant to be strategic at all in some aspects, but think about it this way. If every single thing that you receive from the government is in your mail, is in a language that you did not understand, and then all of a sudden you receive one flyer that is in 3 different languages, 4 different languages, and you all of a sudden understand that something's happening and you can have access to it, you would go. And if one person's telling you word of mouth being like 10A has an activity, all of a sudden it was like the grandmas and grandpas we were servicing every single day, they were telling their friends that this thing was happening. And all of a sudden their expectations were this high for something that was going to happen. They don't even know what. All of a sudden they can understand that something was happening and it was going to be in their language. It was like the floodgates opened. It was Ron.
It was also the ethnic media. We were able to successfully use and engage ethnic media in a meaningful way for the first time. Instead of just making them copy mainstream press like after the fact, we made a very strategic approach to engage them early on and do press conferences before the housing event. We had multiple like advisories to let the media know, and people would also copy the articles in Chinese.
Yeah.
and follow those articles to the events. We learned very early on how impactful ethnic media could be in our community if we use them correctly.
It was an untapped resource because of the fact that I don't think any other office had engaged in them that way. Also, one of the things that we were able to do, and I remember starting it and just like with the transparency part of your office, we were just super transparent about, how many people we were servicing, what the top 3 issues were, and then giving them the information about how to do those things. We called it the DTR.
District Trends Report. We did it for a while as we transitioned into the Tony era of Flushing, and things got so huge and massive, it was hard to keep track. We've experimented along the way with technology. We try to streamline stuff, and then the pandemic hit. There was a number of things that happened, I think, after you left, Yuh-Line, that moved the office in different directions that gave us national spotlights. Not because we wanted to seek that spotlight. When Tony took over, we picked some couple of issues that just resonated. It all started before Yuh-Line left with the nail salon issue.
In your public service, Ron, I think that there were 2 significant points where you had to take a stand, and you were talking about how all of a sudden you were shot into the national spotlight. And there were 2 things, I think, during the time that I was with you, and then a little bit after, while I was campaigning at the time. It was when you first got into the office, the issue of the nail salons and the usury bonds. We were talking about some of the things that impacted your decision then, and some of the things that were unspoken for our community that people did not understand, and your stance on it, the kind of shift that you had to take, and how and why you were shot into the national spotlight for this. It was interesting because it was almost like Cuomo put you a little bit on the spot and tried to get you to take on the governor's bill and his version of things. And I still remember, we were reading it and we were concerned for our community and the impacts that it would have, especially the immigrant community, when you have a product that is like literally the premiums are built off of credit score and credit history when there wasn't any for most immigrants. I think that we realized that and wanted to kind of have you speak a little bit about what changed for you there. And then, I wanted to talk a little bit about when I really saw a shift in you as a public servant after Yang Song's death.
I think the nail salon issue, in much respect, I think I would have handled it much differently. I think I would have been able to push back much more assertively early on. But this was our first big clash. It was like a David versus Goliath kind of moment where the New York Times did this massive spread, a series on how the workers were being treated like slaves at these beauty nail salons. And we had a governor who ruled by through the press and wanted to just dump whatever he could do of reforms and call it a win to make the headlines. And you and I knew that there was so much more to get this right. And we couldn't do it overnight. And we needed to organize the workers and the owners and get them to the table with the labor to understand that we've introduced the wrong solution. It could destroy everyone's lives. And no one wanted to listen. Everyone just wanted to get to that first next New York Times piece. We spent so much time going over their proposed language bill. And we took out 90% of it, and we just marked it up, and we shook with the governor. We signed that bill, and we had a big press conference. Remember, like it was like a first big event with the governor, and we got to speak at that podium. It was such a weird, all of a sudden, spotlight moment for us. And then a month later, he rescinds the agreement and decides to move forward with components of the bill through his unilateral executive order. And then plants a story when we pushed back, said that we sold out. Like the nail salon industry bought us off. It was their language that we took on. We didn't propose anything. That moment was very scary. We learned how government works, how very abusive men with power can destroy people's lives through politics.
I think it was also the money on their end, right? They had the usury bond insurance company money that they were looking for to create a whole new industry in order to line their pockets.
We just got the spotlight. We didn't know how New York Times at that level and how to really push back. But we weren't scared. We kind of walked in, half prepared, understanding only half the story, how the system works. Remember? And Tony and Yuh-Line, we still went on to New York One to debate this. And we got destroyed, unlike with Arrow was like
I was
chilling for
so
Como.
upset. I was
And
so upset.
like,
I
and
had a
that,
nosebleed
yeah.
like right then and there.
I try to hold my own, I just didn't have enough ammunition to push back on live debates. Yuh-Line was crying,
I was crying.
like it
bleeding.
was just like, I can't believe like they're gonna destroy you, Ron. Like, I'm
I
like,
was
what are
so
you talking
upset.
about? I was looking at it, oh my God, I thought I just did fine.
This is like skipping forward 5 million talking points, but later on, well, when you confronted Cuomo on what he did, he literally tried to pull this again out from like nowhere against you. Like he
Yeah.
tried to say it onto national television. I was so upset because I was just like, they're trying to plant these stories and like nobody's gonna correct it because nobody's gonna say like for us, what really happened. Nobody's gonna
Yeah.
actually ever set the record straight because they were only going to print his side.
But they knew exactly what they were
Exactly.
doing.
Exactly.
Alfonso David at the General Counsel used to work with the Attorney General's office, had contacts at the U.S. Attorney's office. So they planted a story to push me down, suppress me. That resulted in, I don't know, Tony, I don't know if you're at the office or Yuh-Line was at
I
the
was.
office. They subpoenaed everybody
Yeah,
Yep.
it was
based
They
me.
on
subpoenaed you.
planted
Yep.
story. My treasurer broke down his door in his apartment, and this was all designed by design. And this is how, and I learned looking back, oh my God, the system can be abused when you have terrible people in positions of power. They did that just to suppress me. I had to spend $75,000 out of my campaign fund just to respond to one subpoena. They knew exactly what they were doing.
Wow.
Didn't result in anything, with nothing to hide. We turned over every email, every
Yeah.
bill that was mocked up.
Yeah.
We didn't do anything wrong. I was like, it was their bill. We mocked up. We shook on it. And then they're the one that rescinded on our agreement because they're being bought off. But yet, because he's got the platform, soapbox, they accuse me.
And we
Now
were
I'm like
so
getting,
new to all of
we
this.
were so new. We didn't know how to.
Mhm.
We just thought that things worked in a very fair way, and there was justice, and we represent the interests of our immigrant small business owners and the people in
And
our
the
community
workers.
and the workers that were getting. We were offering the right solution, and we were the ones that got abused. That moment just completely shifted and reset the way we thought about government and how we move forward in dealing with power. When we punch up at power, how to be prepared and know exactly how to do it with the right allies and at the right time. And also give us tremendous courage as a team that, hey, we just got our butts kicked by the most powerful man in the country, and we're still standing and we're still fighting. I think that gave us a lot of fortitude just at the right time when Yuh-Line was entering her political career.
It made me see you in a very different way also. I still remember, when you were driving away and I was like still in tears and you were just like, watching you cry right now makes me want to drive off a bridge. At the same time, that was what was the most significant moment for me when after I won office and like, I do you remember I called you up and I was like, I just really wanted to apologize to you because I didn't realize the pressure you were under. All I saw was like the response from the media and all of the things, and I didn't understand like your own personal pressure that you were feeling at that moment because you felt like, first off, everything was really unfair. Second, like people were twisting things that were not twistable in my mind. And yet, like you said, you were still standing. The way that the executive came at us and like the way that he used all of the powers that he could to squash us and like to take, literally you were barely in your second term and they were just like squeezing you so hard for everything. I remember just thinking how horrible and how horrifying it was when I received the subpoena for like all of this thing. Like when I saw like what was going on to you, it was horrifying to watch because first and foremost, all we were doing was literally speaking up for people. I just remember thinking, I had no idea the pressure. All I saw was like me trying to protect you. I didn't understand beyond that until I was in that position, and I remember calling you up and being like, I still remember that moment. And it was so striking because like the look in your eyes and like the way that you felt so much responsibility, I felt like if it wasn't a stronger person, it would have been like crushing. But I felt your strength in that moment. And I also felt the weight that you felt on your responsibility for the community, for representing, and for wanting to make some change in how things were done in government. I saw a new determination in you. The thing that shifted again, I think, in your public service, in your empathy for folks, and I think that's where I also saw the most of like who you were as a person was, I think, the night that you called me, after Yang Song had died. I talked for hours that night. You were really afraid at what you saw in government and in police, in what was going on right in front of us. And that nobody was speaking up for. As you know, in our office, when we were doing all that constituent casework, we did have sex workers that came in who did ask for help. I told you about the woman who had gotten her head bashed in, her eye was literally almost coming out of her head. She was a sex worker, but she was just really afraid of losing her grandson. I had told you that story because it was a constituent that came into our office, but I think at that time, you had a very different perspective on sex work. And right after what had happened to Yang Song and your investigation, and this is when Tony took the chief of staff seat, at that time, I think your shift, and you called me, that was really interesting because you called me and you were saying that it opened your eyes to what I was saying about sex work. I think that it shifted also your perspective on the kind of services and the changes in the law that we needed to see.
Just like a lot of these issues, it's based on who comes into our office. After Yang Sung's death, it was her brother and her mother that were coming to our district office, traveling all the way back from China to trying to claim her body and to expose the truth, because her brother was in constant communication with her and no one wanted to sit down with them, none of the local elected officials. And I remember, I think it was either Tony or others in our office that were meeting with them in the conference room, and I was in my other room and I just overheard through the window what was happening, and I walked in to hear directly, and I felt compelled to listen in, because sometimes when you hear a cry of desperation, you just naturally get drawn to it and you want to be helpful. That's how it started for me. After seeing how desperate his family was, showing me all the texts that they were having leading up to her death, and how she never wanted to commit suicide. She had an airplane ticket to go back home to see her family the following weekend, but the police had framed it as she was suicidal and jumped out the window. And for people who have not followed the story about Yang Song, she was working as a massage worker, sex worker in Flushing, 38 years old. And for many, many months, she was being targeted by undercover vice police officer, particularly one police officer who had abused her and who she claimed had raped her by gunpoint. She had all this evidence, and the more that she spoke out, she even went to the local precinct to identify a person. Instead of filing her complaint, they sent more undercover cops to abuse her and threaten her that she'll get deported if she doesn't shut up, even though she was a legally married U.S. citizen. She reached a point where there was another targeted raid at her place when they didn't touch anyone else, they didn't go to any other floor, but just her workplace on the third floor, where she was eventually jumped off the balcony. She didn't die in impact. She died in agony after hours and hours of suffering and pain in the hospital. There was video footages of the front side, and there were whistleblowers in the block that came out independently, but all of a sudden, all those footages and evidence disappeared. Right?
Things that Ron saw, which was crazy, like videos that Ron literally watched with his eyes, and they're just gone. So
we wanted accountability. It was a very targeted accountability of a unit that was created that became very abusive, the Vice unit. And everyone knew it. Everyone in the community knew how abusive this group was becoming. It was scary because no one in our community dared to speak up against the NYPD. It's just something that we don't do. Politically, it's not popular. People want to submit and subjugate themselves to the authority. That's just the culture that we belong to. And especially now, and back then it wasn't as bad, but especially now with the hate crimes and the violence, people don't ever want to question anything that the NYPD does. They want to just roll out the red carpet. So at a time when it was like that, for us to say we need to hold them accountable for what they did,
really hard decision.
It was a hard decision. And also the NYPD's, there's a whole different bureaucratic structure and people behind NYPD that people are scared of. There's reasons why every mayor that comes along, they have to play nicely with the NYPD. For us to go from Andrew Cuomo to now to call the the NYPD accountable, it was a very daunting thing to do, but it was the right thing to do, and it led to a number of reforms. And eventually, I think the device unit was dismantled. We went back into more of a community-driven solution, and we worked for years to try to help these workers directly to rejoin the former sector if they want to, and help them with resumes. And when we discovered later was that when they have a criminal record, it was virtually impossible for them to rejoin the former sector. Even though almost every worker wanted to go back into the former sector, they couldn't do it. We created this like horrible system where we put them in this informal sector and we made it impossible for them to get out of it. But yet we're dehumanizing them and we're calling them all sorts of names, and we're blaming them for wanting to be in this sex work business, instead of understanding that we designed an economy that simply doesn't work for so many people in our communities.
A little bit also has to do with the fact that like there's like little credit accessible, like some of the things that were going on making it so that, you know, they were seen as the criminals. Like I was telling you about the woman who had her head bashed in, like she was assaulted by somebody, and yeah, she wasn't able to talk to the police or file a report or do any of those things because people would see her as the criminal.
And I'm dealing with this issue again in every re-election. People send out this nasty, flyers and negative mailers that Ron Kim wants to create a red light district. Meanwhile, there's a whole growing community in our neighborhoods that continue to dehumanize anyone that's not part of the mainstream economy when they don't fit into the perfect picture of being an Asian American. But the reality is we have so many people getting left behind, so many people in poverty, day laborers, sex workers, street vendors that are just desperate to fit in and try to like make things work. And instead of solving these issues, these really, really hard problems, and holding people like me accountable to solve the economic problem, they're telling me to just dehumanize them and lock them up and call them prostitutes and spit on them and make sure that they just don't get a chance at anything. That's actually much easier for politicians to do, to say, lock everyone up and throw the key. That is the ultimate pandering, populist, easy thing to say in a moment like this. It is much, much harder to offer solutions to make sure that we could create a better economy for all.
So I know we were talking about two things, the nail salon issue, and from there to what happened with the Yang Song case. I think they're both great examples of how the passing of laws, like you were saying, Ron, is one thing, but the actual enforcement and administering of those laws can be entirely different from the state, especially for the most vulnerable people. Those were both moments, as you and Yuh-Line were mentioning, that were very tough. You had to make very tough choices. One of them because you had sort of broken out into prominence on a new level for the first time, where you were actually personally shepherding a bill and trying to amend it, and then being there as the main sponsor of it in a photo op with the governor, right, for the first time. And then you found out what he and his team were actually doing, not actually enforcing it fairly, and then passing unilateral mandates. You had to make a tough choice about whether you would just be a team player, right, as you used to disparagingly call it, or stand up for your community. And then the same thing, the Yang Song case, where you had to enter territory that wasn't necessarily politically sound. Again, you made a difficult decision, which I think a lot of your decisions, they're just kind of intuitive almost, like they're on the spur on the moment. You want to help someone who's in need, and then you decide to do that.
Those critical moments in our office was centered around people that were impacted the most. Instead of listening and following the orders of industry kind of stakeholders that see social problems as an opportunity to make money or extract value, we wanted to offer solutions and find a way to make the administration work for our most vulnerable people. And oftentimes we're the ones that end up suffering when we take these fights, because we're pitted against very powerful voices. When there's multiple industries that profit from every social ill, and then you're saying, okay, we're going to stop you from exploiting our communities, and we're going to activate government to solve some of these biggest social problems that we've been left behind with in our neighborhoods for decades. You're picking fights with people that relied on billions and billions of dollars from
Yeah.
profiting off social problems, right? So naturally, you get primaried. Naturally, you get challenged, and people
Mhm.
want to take you out because too much money is at stake for outside individuals and groups that see places like Flushing as a way to extract money, value, and profits from.
Oftentimes those laws that, we try and pass, they're only as good as the power that gets put behind them to enforce them. And a lot of times power comes from other sources that we have no control over, like money is power. And we saw that, I think, very acutely with the Amazon issue that came up when they decided they wanted to come and build this giant new headquarters in Queens. And you were I think the first and the loudest voice against that, especially in 2019, the public advocates race.
There's another case that we decided to punch up at the wealthiest person, Jeff Bezos, on the planet at the time. He wanted to extract 3.5 billion dollars of tax breaks and tax subsidies and created this race to the bottom competition for 2 years, pitting cities
And
and
states against
communities
one another.
against each other. He did it at a scale that we never seen before. Obviously, people compete against each other for business all the time, but not put it out there publicly, making a mockery of our democracy. And I just felt so disgusted that there were mayors making YouTube clips. Come to my town. We're going to give you this package. We're going to give you, like, it was like, what are you doing? I wanted to reset and show the public that's not how we create value. You have to hold your mayor and politicians accountable to build better schools, to have after school program, to build better bridges, to build better senior centers, all the things that add intrinsic value that draw in the talent to come to your communities. And then the talent will bring in the companies to come to recruit that talent. That's how you create intrinsic value. Whatever you're doing to give out incentives, that's very short-term minded because once you give out money to a company, it's never going to stop. It just spirals out of control and they just
Exactly.
money and value out of your communities in the long run. And that's what's happening right all across big towns, big cities that have subsidized money for big corporations. We did it in our own state and we
Yes.
didn't learn from it. Elon Musk, Solar Wind in Buffalo, it cost us $1.5 million per one job that we created. And even though we had these facts, again, the special interest groups, the media, the lobbyist class, everyone between, they control the narrative. Everyone wanted to be in that picture with Jeff Bezos cutting that ribbon because that was going to get the New York Times headlines, right? The headlines was going to be Governor Andrew Cuomo creates 3,000 jobs next 5 years, but they're not going to mention how much money we're going to be losing out of taxpayers' pockets.
Extracting from our communities.
So none of that will be. That's just the way that we've normalized how these things get covered. And I think all the things that our office learned along the way, starting from the nail salons and other big cases, it gave us the confidence to articulate these points in an effective way to push back, which ultimately led to Amazon not taking the subsidy, but as we predicted, still came to New York to create the same number of jobs, if not more.
Thousands.
So we were right about that call.
Yeah, I mean, we did a deep dive into it once the issue came into our focus, and we saw pretty clearly, like in most cases, when governments give these subsidies to businesses to come to their state or their city, they don't work out in the end. Almost all of them don't work out, and if you think about it, that makes sense. If they were going to succeed as a business, then they can just do that without the subsidy, without taxpayer money. It's hard to beat a flashy headline. So Amazon, they made one by saying they're going to come to New York and Virginia, and then they made another one when they said they're going to pull out, and they canceled it, which I guess was a success for what you were campaigning for. But the real story, like you said, was that they quietly came to New York anyway and expanded and built all these different offices because that's what they were going to do all along, right? After all, them having all these mayors and governors sort of grovel for them and raw the red carpet for them, they did what they were going to do all along. They put half of their headquarters at the financial capital of America and the other half at the political capital of America, or near it.
Did your constituents understand your position? And when Amazon pulled out, were they satisfied with your advocacy?
No, no, it was my constituents were more in favor of the brand. They didn't understand the economics behind Amazon, but at the time they understood the brand of Amazon. So when they polled, they were high favorable fans of Amazon. The district when Amazon, the Long Island City, those constituents were actually much more sophisticated, which is why all the local electeds there came on board to criticize and push back on Amazon. But for the most part, it was a tough fight. Even the first interview I did when the former borough president, this is what triggered me. I remember I was in my office, Tony, and I think you were at your desk, and I was in my office, and you left a copy of the Queen's Chronicle on my desk. The front cover of the Queen's Chronicle has a former borough president saying, "We are primed for Amazon to come to Queens." Oh, that just something like triggered me so bad. Tony, we're going, whole New York one, we're gonna go to the site where they're proposing this warehouse and we're gonna protest it. And it was a one-man protest and New York
Right.
won. No one else showed up. Well, I made the case and New York won, but the industry lined up 5 validators and they made me look like a crazy man in front of this site criticizing Amazon, but there was a moment where there were people behind me that were not in the mainstream light yet. And there were people who studied this issue for many, many years. It propelled them to come up, and it was a risk. I didn't know they were going to get behind it. I didn't know what was going to happen. But I thought that it was the right thing to say and it was the right position to take. And luckily, that opened up a whole floodgate of
The
people
unions.
who come in and
Um,
truth that
I brought
Amazon
in folks from Seattle.
and I think that we peaked when we wrote an op-ed for the New York Times with Zephyr Teashow making a clear case to say no to Amazon and protect local businesses instead.
You had the clash with Cuomo during the nail salons, and this was in a way the second big clash. Where were you at? Did Cuomo have a target on you at this point?
There are people in my circle that keep a long tab of enemies and a list of people that we feel vindictive toward. I personally let go of those things. Even though the nail salon was deeply traumatic to not just me, to my family, I told myself I signed up for this. This is what I decided to be in. I had nothing against the former governor. This was all about policies and the bad economic subsidies. I never called him out by name, around this issue, even though he went around parading that he was willing to change his first name to Amazon to bring Amazon to New York. We never directly went after him. It was more about the substance of what they were proposing. And then based on that, we won. We made their case. They pulled back. But politically, we got hurt because they controlled the narrative. They were much better at controlling the press. I think they pulled out on Valentine's Day, and the entire public sentiment made it seem like Ron Kim, I think Mike Gianaris, and a couple of other electeds caused thousands of jobs to go away from New York. That was the headline, basically. But we knew that time will give us the truth. At the end of the day, we were prepared to lose it all for the right issues. We knew that. I think Tony knew that, and Yuh-Line knew that. These are calculated and dangerous positions to take politically, but we all told ourselves, like, what is the point of being in public service if we're not willing to take these tough positions and willing to lose? I think other members, I think AOC and other members, when they first got elected, they said that they were functioning as if they only had one day in office. And what would you do with that one day to make change?
Or one term.
That's the approach that we took. And we need to have principled issues that we're willing to die on a hill for. At these critical moments, we felt passionately that this was the right call. And we made the case with validators and people who did the work to show and illustrate why giving $3.5 billion of subsidies was the wrong call at that time.
Yeah. I think also it was very different comparing all these different incidents, because on the Amazon issue, it was difficult, but like you said, there were other prominent elected officials who were willing to be brave enough to take up the same stance. Whereas it sort of feels like whenever you're the lone voice standing out, on something controversial, like with both parts of the Cuomo saga, the glare is much brighter and it's really much more intense when it's just you and it's focused on you, right?
He wasn't alone in the Cuomo stuff.
For a certain period of time, it probably felt like it, right? Like, do you want to talk about when that started, the second part of the Cuomo stuff?
Are we still want to talk about Amazon or the nursing home stuff? Are you transition?
I was transitioning to nursing home stuff.
We didn't start off to pick a fight with Andrew Cuomo. That was never the intent. In fact, I went against progressive colleagues like Yuh-Line and others at the very beginning of COVID when they were adamantly opposing giving Cuomo any money and not giving any more unilateral power to make decisions because they were warning that we can't trust this governor. And
Oh yeah, no, I was like, we can't do that. I was one of the only people who voted against his additional powers, actually.
I felt very strongly to give him a chance because I felt like my constituents were scared and Donald Trump wasn't doing anything for us. Part of me was like, all right, I might have had clash with this guy, but he's Action Como. If there's ever a moment for him to step in and like take charge, maybe this is the kind of persona we need in this crisis moment, right? And I wanted to give him that chance. At that point in my career, and Tony, you were there with me on this, any executive, doesn't matter what party or leaning, that's willing to activate administrative power to do the right thing, I wanted to give that person a working chance. Once you give him a chance, my job is to hold him accountable. And I feel like that's what we did after he got his powers and he got his money. And we were on the ground when we got that call from constituents in a nursing home. And DOH, his administration was nowhere to be found. And they were actually trying to gaslight the people on the ground and they were hiding death toll numbers on purpose. And instead of sending out administrators, they're sending out industry lobbyists first to control the message of how they're going to present it. And I'm like, this is really bad.
Can you talk about that more, just step by step, what happened? So you decided to take another chance and trust that he would use his newfound powers to protect New York during
Wasn't
COVID.
newfound, it was granted.
Newly granted, I'm sorry, newly granted powers. COVID had just happened, our offices had shut down, and he had this power, and then you received a call from a woman whose mom was in a nursing home in our district, right? What happened at that time?
We got another very frantic constituent call. And just like any of these frantic calls, I think Tony, you and others try to screen these calls. Sometimes these are very irrational and sometimes people are not all put together, but something of my gut, and usually these are just gut calls, and Yuh-Line and everyone knows this, like sometimes stories seem really genuine and concerning. I decided to just call that person back directly and hear for myself what's going on. And I believed her when she told me that they're literally killing her mom. If they don't get her mom out of this facility, she's going to die. And this
She was telling these, horrifying stories about, like, at least that facility, of bodies just being taken out, many bodies daily, and how harrowing that was, right?
They were saying this is a state-sanctioned mass execution of seniors, and they won't let me in. The guy's being confrontational. He's being physical. Like they won't let me see my own mom. I mean, it was just like how it was unbelievable. It felt like wartime stories, right? Like people are being executed and there's nothing that they can do. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go see you on site tomorrow. And I remember calling a bunch of like my colleagues because again, I learned my lesson. I got going alone into any of these fights. It's like I need support. No one wanted to be with me to meet this woman. They all felt comfortable enough writing a letter to Commissioner Howard Zucker, the former health commissioner. That was like the conclusion that they came to. For me, it wasn't good enough. And we found a way to get into the nursing home. Remember, Tony, we were diplomatic. Instead of taking a hard approach, we offered PP, what do you call it?
Yeah, to the director.
Yes. Mhm.
Right, try to earn the director's trust. And then he eventually opened up and told us the real death toll numbers that wasn't disclosed to the public. There was a huge discrepancy between what the governor's people were communicating versus what these facilities were actually telling us. I'm like, this is huge. I mean,
It was a ridiculous mandate that they did.
they're hiding.
Right.
data.
That same Department of Health Commissioner, Howard Zucker, and like Yuh-Line said, their mandate, right?
That's how it all started. Up to that point, we're still communicating with the governor because remember, like I sponsored and pushed this bill to give him the money, $40 million at DOH.
It's like so nothing. I was so mad at that whole bill.
Because of that, we were still kind of communicating. And the moment that I started to ask these tough questions, everything stopped. No one would respond to any of my emails. Even if they did, it was just like they didn't have any answers.
But you were still in the room with Dick Gottfried and representing the assembly in that conversation where Melissa DeRosa said what she did.
I wasn't the chair of the Committee on Aging when that
Right.
happened, pointed later on. But what did happen, and this is when Yuh-Line and then Senator Biaggi got deeply involved. They did a series of bills and unilateral mandates and last minute stick-ins in the budget that took away patients' rights overnight and give the industry
Legal immunity.
basically a license to kill people without any recourse. The governor orchestrated three things at the order of the industry lobbyist: waive medical record keeping at nursing homes, ban people from entering the space, any family caregivers that can't go in, and give them a legal immunity from prosecution and lawsuits. It was an incredible set of things that led to thousands and thousands of more deaths. Basically, hospitals and everyone in the industry sent people to nursing homes to die and illegally die. Instead of going the other way, strengthening people's rights, instead of protecting the right to care, they completely stripped away their constitutional rights. So no one will get sued. Or the governors, like top donors, will be protected, shielded from lawsuits.
That means like even if you weren't in a hospital or a nursing home for COVID, if you were, say, for example, scheduled for surgery and they sewed scissors into your stomach or something, you would not be able to sue. They had complete legal immunity. And this was all through his executive orders. These were one of his many, many, many executive orders in that period of time, all given to him through that bill.
It was also like impossible because there was no eyewitnesses and there was no medical record. Yeah. So people die from misdiagnosed medicine, pills that they shouldn't be taking, or not been given those pills, including while I was doing all this, my uncle who died in a local nursing home in Flushing in mid-April of 2020. So while I'm like going from nursing home to fight for
other people's family members,
my old uncle, who I thought who was a veteran, who's got veteran benefits, they're gonna protect the veteran, right? Like, how could they possibly let a veteran die in a place like this? He died alone, and no one knew what happened until after the fact. All that led to this moment of us pushing back, repealing the law. It took us 6 full months to repeal totally. We repealed partial part of it. I think Yuh-Line and Senator Biaggi were on the call at 1 a.m., strategizing. Senator Biaggi carried the other bill on the Senate, trying to restore people's basic rights to care in nursing homes.
And at the same time, he was putting into the budget permanent legal immunity for hospitals.
That was done on April 1st, celebrated. So the bill that I introduced on April 5th would repeal what he did on April 1st. We learned from the past conflicts with the governor. So Tony and our team led the way. We've issued a number of reports on legal immunity and the impact of legal immunity, the status of nursing homes, and then eventually got picked up by some national publications, which opened up a lane for us to hold him accountable. They did everything they could to hide it, to gaslight us. He went on CNN with Chris Cuomo.
He wrote a book.
At the peak of all that, he wrote a book
for $5 million.
$5-6 million for that book. Right at the peak of it, the speaker appoints me as the chair of one of the main committees that oversaw this issue, that was in the same room with the governor. And 7 months later, when they came to us with the truth of what happened, and they were trying to communicate, one of his top aides admitted in a private conversation, Melissa DeRosa, that they committed criminal fraud against the federal government by not complying with the federal request for data. They purposely hid life and death data. In her own words, she was like, we didn't know what to do. The federal government asked for the information. We didn't know what to give them. I'm like, okay. It sounds like a coordinated effort to not comply and hide data. And just so we get a context, you can't hide life and death data in the middle of a pandemic.
15,000 deaths they erased.
If we had that information in real time, we would have acted differently. We would have activated the $2 billion of emergency natural money that was just sitting there in our state war chest. We would have activated the National Guard. Like, we would have done so much more to save lives. They hid that data because he was chasing down a $6 million bug, and he didn't want to change the narrative of becoming a national hero against Donald Trump. Many of us refer to this era as eldercide. We committed eldercide because one person, one administration was greedy and wanted to profit for themselves and extract privileges and money from a crisis instead of solving and confronting the problem.
Soon after that happened, you received a fateful call from Governor Cuomo himself.
Well, it was because there was a leak, not leak.
Right, there's a
Several-
leak of that meeting that led to reporting
Several
on.
legislators were in that
Yeah.
meeting, Dick Gottfried and Gustavo, also as healthcare chairs. And there was a couple of other people as well. Social services, the aging chairs.
Aging and health, 3 chairs.
Wasn't that meeting recorded by someone?
The governor's people recorded it.
I asked them to meet in person instead of a Zoom call, actually in fear of something like this, because I wanted to have an honest face-to-face conversation with them and keep it off the record because I wanted honest feedback. But they insisted, the governor's people, that we keep it virtual. I'm like, okay, you keep it Zoom. You never know who's listening in, who's like recording the Zoom calls. I even warned the governor's people, maybe we can't have an honest conversation over Zoom. They embraced it and it got leaked. And as predicted, I still remember Dick Gottfried. As soon as Melissa said that,
Dick Gottfried was very upset by what she said.
he texted all of us. We were having a group text while we're Zooming. And I think his exact words, like, I think she committed, what is it? Like he accused her of committing a federal crime.
Criminal malpractice, I think is what he said, I believe. I think you had said something in a quote after they were, somebody was confirming the call to, I think it was the New York Post. And then the governor's office called you to try to rescind your comment.
The governor called to not just rescind, but he spent 10 minutes threatening my career. He started from the top. You've always been in pain, blah, 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 and letting me know that I don't know the code of conduct, basically. Like, there's certain rules that you have to follow. All these, like, very
Messed up things, threats.
you see in the movies. Like, I feel like I was in the back room of The Godfather. It was right around Lunar New Year, right? It was the day before the Lunar New Year.
And you were like bathing your children at the time.
I called a close lawyer friend and he advised me right away to jot down everything from the conversation. So I took meticulous notes of the conversation, every word that I could remember what he said. And the next day I spoke to a real lawyer. It was a friend's father who represented me from there on, pro bono. That following Saturday morning, the governor himself and about 7 other people tried to call me, but I refused to pick up at the advice of my attorney. Lunar New Year weekend, you had like all these people trying to reach out to me, text me, try to call the governor back, because I think they understood that they made a mistake. He should not have gotten on that phone. Out of all the chairs that was in that meeting, he picked on the one Asian person who suffered personally from his policies. There was no concern, no condolences to my uncle, just straight threats.
What was the quote to the Post?
It wasn't the quote itself. It was more them asking me to tell a different version. It's like asking someone who witnessed a hit and run and telling them that you saw something else. Yeah.
But you told them what happened in the meeting. You shared what Melissa said.
But the reporter had the word
She
for
already
word.
had it.
It was a first-hand sourced article, and my quote on the bottom did not impact the outcome of that article. So it was going to run regardless. But what they asked me to do was go back and tell a different version of how I understood Melissa differently. By definition, there's only one truth. Like, I can't tell different versions. I know that you specialize, in telling different versions of the truth, but my side of the world, like, there's only one truth. She said what she said. It's very clear.
No one else on that call was asked to confirm that narrative.
No one else picked up their phones. In fact, Dick Godfrey had his phone off for 3 days. One of the chairs.
Purposefully, he knows what was up. He's not the longest serving legislator of all time for no reason.
We like to dodge conflicts when it comes at them. This was like my issue. We had things that we need to reform, and we kind of subconsciously like embraced the moment, because in order for administrative changes, not to like have him ousted or resign or expelled or whatever, the governor, but in order order to improve administration, like we have to see certain crisis moments to push the right policies. And in this moment, we all knew that we had to repeal the legal immunity fully, and we had to restore patients' rights, and we had to usher in a lot of changes to the industry, which we did. And after I shared what happened with CNN and New York Times about how I was threatened by the governor, I remember I was still in my house in upstate. I didn't tell Allison that I was going to do it, that I was going to tell the press. Meanwhile, Yuh-Line and Julie, they were already setting it up for the reporters to call
Yeah,
me.
we were.
Like, you gotta talk to Ron Kim. Go call something. Oh my God, something happened so big. So I'm getting all these calls. By coincidence, CNN and New York Times now were competing to break the story first. New York Times wasn't gonna make this a main piece story. It was going to be a side story, but all of a sudden they got wind through like Yuh-Line and others that CNN's going to do it. So now they're like trying to be CNN to be the first. And that same day that the story broke, the governor decided to make true of his threat and used 20 minutes of his daily COVID press conference to talk shit about me, how corrupt I was.
Brought up the nail salons.
Brought up the nail salons, that he took nail salon money, and like he's running a syndicate of nail salon dirty business. People were texting me left and right. Why is the governor talking about you in nail salons? 2 hours later, the CNN, New York Times broke like literally 1 minute after each other, and then the rest spiraled from there. He was trying to do the same exact thing. He think that he had the platform. If he accused someone of wrongdoing, that was enough to reduce that politician into oblivion with subpoenas and etc. But this time around, it was the other way around, because he's the one who took millions of dollars from lobbyists to pass these word for word bills that the lobbyists handed him to pass.
I literally remember the talking, like literally the white paper that they handed us. And I remember reading it inside of committee and being like, okay. And then I saw it again in budget. That was like how word for word it was.
I gotta say, Tony kept it together at the office for us. I don't know how he did it.
Like you said, it was very jarring when he targeted you out of nowhere on his national platform that he had at that point. You know, it's like what we were saying before, you can't always control the media environment, but in this instance, it was favorable. I guess he was at a point where he was near the height of his popularity, but there were all these things coming out about him. And like Yuh-Line said, you were ultimately not alone, because there's this whole other side to him with these stories about sexual harassment, assault, women in his workplace that started coming out. It was the right environment where reporters wanted to cover it if you were willing to speak and you were brave enough to do that. And yeah, we were getting so many calls from the media every day, inquiries. Would you say that this moment was as stressful or maybe more stressful than some of the earlier moments in your career you talked about where you were having physical reactions?
It was pretty insane because it was COVID. I didn't have to go to the studios. I was literally in a shirt like this in my boxers doing 20 national like interviews, and it was like nonstop. That ultimately led to our breakthrough watershed moment on The View, where Yuh-Line, Tony, and everyone else, we were very strategic in how we were going to frame the governor on The View. The View had the traditional, the homosexual fans, where he had all these women that thought that he was very attractive, like manly man type. And we went in there exposing the toxic, abusive side of this person. And we made a very conscious choice to use the words he's abusive and not just portray him as a bully, because the playground bully thing, everyone can just kind of laugh it off. I'm like, oh, just get used to it, Ron. Like, this is your part of your job. But to portray him as someone who abused his power and his position, I think was very effective.
I also think another thing is like Cuomo would say things about women all the time. Like he would say that we were fucking idiots or whatever for the women legislators. But the fact of the matter is a huge difference in revealing his character was that you're a guy who most people would find physically formidable and also somebody who people would not say like, oh, well, you know, you're just being bullied or whatever. And I think like that changed a lot of people's perspectives and visuals. It was a very noticeable visual and emotional shift for a lot of folks when you told your story.
You know, on The View, we were very conscious about mentioning how he treated you and Biaggi in the past. There was a moment where they were pushing back against the governor, I think a couple of years before that, around the budget issues when he was trying to take advantage. Instead of engaging them in a meaningful conversation, they sent a spokesperson to call them a couple of fucking idiots to the New York Times. That's how they talk to women lawmakers.
What I thought was really important at the time when Ron was being harassed was also to get folks who were our colleagues to stand up behind Ron. What I noticed when things happened to us was that we didn't get support from leadership, from our colleagues. It was that we were not being collegial, even though we weren't the ones who called anybody fucking idiots. Like, we were the ones somehow not being collegial. Whereas with Ron, I just felt like it was so ridiculous that we didn't have people speaking up for him in public. I was probably one of the first to be like, this is indicative of Cuomo's abusive behavior, but it was one of the things where I just felt like it was so necessary. I had several phone calls with colleagues where I just wanted to make sure that Ron got the support that he needed. The drive for me was the fact that it was deeply, deeply unfair, and people could not just like have him, hanging off the ledge by himself when everybody knew. It was not a secret that Cuomo was completely abusive. He was so scary. The legislature was afraid because of how he could ruin their lives, threaten them. And he would call people, threaten them, threaten their families, and it was just inappropriate at all times. It was unprofessional, and it was scary, and it was really disturbing that nobody was willing to speak up about it.
The most morally demoralizing moment was when we got on a private conference call with colleagues to discuss what we're going to do.
Yep.
Actual members who were no longer there, who went after me in our own conference, saying Ron Kim is the bully, and Ron Kim is the one that's going after the governor, and try to portray this abusive man, the governor, as the victim in our own conference. Still remember, like I logged off.
There were people who compared him to Central Park 5 and Emmett Till. That was the level of where people were operating from, this like blind loyalty / fear / whatever. I had a big relief, and I will credit Carl after this, but like, Carl did stick up for you, and I was glad for that, because that led to the rest of our colleagues later on standing up for you.
Carl and I, the speaker and I, are good. We're good friends. Part of me is I didn't communicate enough back to him. I didn't bridge that gap. I didn't call for help when I should have. I just put myself in this isolated place.
The speaker had to be the one to lead in that moment, and I give him a lot of credit for that.
We all saw eventually what happened with Cuomo, with the governor having to resign, and it sort of felt like everything came full circle. At least for me, because when I entered, that was the moment, 2015, we were talking about, when they completely overwhelmed you with all his connections and power. And now 2021, 22, same thing, right? Like the same Alfonso David that was using his contacts to target you and demean and gaslight you. After the governor resigns, he himself is having to resign from his well-placed position as the director of a nonprofit, because it turned out he had been using those same shady powers to go after his other victims, not just to mess with lawmakers like you. Did you feel vindication at that point?
Yes and no. I think we felt like the victims and the family that we were fighting for felt some relief that someone who abused their powers was no longer in office, but they also wanted more accountability. Like his resignation didn't mean there was accountability, not to just go after the man himself, but I think him going through the impeachment process would have given the family a sense of closure, because all the truth, all the discovery, all the things that he did wrong will now come out to full light. And that's what the family wanted. Not to crucify one person, right? But the mistakes that administration made should have been public, so we don't make those mistakes again. And that's what the family sought. And we didn't have that. We still don't have that.
And I felt the legislature gave him such an easy out. Personally, I felt like that was very unfair to the families that were harmed by him, and people who were harmed by him, his own staff that were harmed by him.
The irony is he's still trying to make a comeback, and he blames Republicans that do anything to
and us. He does blame us.
For the most part, when something goes bad, he just reduces it to right-wing Republican talking points. But the irony is, it was politics that saved him. It was our own party, this Democratic Party, that gave him cover. So when it works out for him, it's great. But whenever someone's pushing back, oh, it's all right-wingers that's coming after me. But I think the point is, what we did, and I'm reflecting as I'm talking on this, did leave an indelible mark in democratic accountability. Even though the same people have the same influence, it's not the same in terms of us holding the executive accountable. There's a foundation of how to do our jobs better as lawmakers. And part of that job entails oversight and accountability of the executive office that we're doing in a much more effective way now than before.
I think we're going to move towards our final thoughts. Ron, can you speak on how this experience put you on the path, not even just as a public servant, but your personal mission, how it's coalesced and what that looks like?
To be honest, it's a little bit hard to have perspective on it in this particular moment because I'm back to kind of square one campaigning and just living every day in a very short lens. When you're in a competitive election, you're just trying to win and you're just trying to get through the day. I think I have a much better perspective after this election because we haven't had this type of full-blown campaign since the first one. Even though we've been challenged before, I haven't been engaged in the campaign side, testing myself with the voters the way they were doing now, going door to door and doing all the press and talking to people and meeting new groups that are now part of the equation. I guess I can reflect that it's much different than 12 years ago, how I feel about it. I feel much more well-rounded in terms of approaching these conversations and less fearful than 12 years ago. I can set boundaries too, compared to 12 years ago. There's more clear lines that I believe in, that I'm willing to cross and not cross. It's also difficult because we feel like we did so much to help people to punch up at the right powers to defend our people. But at the end of the day, you get rewarded by our own people trying to take you down for the wrong reasons. I feel a little bit jaded by that. I think the one thing that drives me the most is trying to understand whether I have in my office the ability to go from extracting privileges for a select few or large group versus actually fixing problems and solutions, offering solutions and social problems. I think there's a difference. Whether we can admit it or not, we're pitted by design, and Yuh-Line said this all the time. We think we do things by design. By design, we're forced to be pitted against each other in the budget, in the way that we function, to extract more privileges for our own people in our communities, in our district, out of the government system. But when have we actually solved problems? When do we actually solve poverty? Like homelessness, mental illness. We're just extracting privileges to serve a few class of people here and there and try to expand on these privileges, but we haven't really done anything to guarantee people's rights and protect people's rights. That's what drives me now.
I think I was referring to your championing or your advocating for the aging in New York State, and how while there are lots of issues that you care about, this very hard path that you've been on has really created kind of a hero in you for this community.
Definitely, we've taken on very complex issues. Tony and Yuh-Line, we both clashed, collaborated on many of these issues around long-term care, around home care, nursing homes, because it is complex between Medicaid, insurance, providers, nonprofits. The equation is so big and broken that things can be lost and be misunderstood at times. I picked fights with one of the largest nonprofit providers, trying to hold them accountable, but nothing personal, right? Now we're back trying to work together, trying to fix it together. So we're constantly going back and forth, but in the middle of it all, we shifted the conversation from taking the power for the first time away from intermediary insurance companies to the actual people on the ground and how we can get the payments directly to the people in a more fair, transparent, and efficient way. So for the first time in a budget, we were able to achieve language that will take away funding from MLTCs to pay for home care. It's an incredible step because insurance companies have so much lobbying power and money, and we don't know how much money they're collecting in fees before we pay for home care. And part of the bottleneck is because of this middleman space that we spend hours, and as you've done this too for our loved ones. All they do is deny because the more they deny, the more they can charge up and keep the profits for themselves. Now we're warning them that we're prepared to go back to a state fee-for-service home care model. I can't believe we actually put that in the budget line. It's an incredible, I think, step for older adults, for caregivers, that we're willing to hold some of the most powerful companies accountable.
3 minutes ago, you're talking about not being really able to reflect in this moment because you're campaigning and there's a certain amount of like feeling jaded in that process. And yet you talk about this and you're like so amped and happy talking about, what your job is and feeling pride in being able to accomplish that for your community. I want to thank you all for your time, especially Ron in the middle of campaigning. I've known Ron since he was a staffer for John Liu. The thing about Ron is what he talked about very early on. The instinct to protect and do right has always been there. And I agree, Yuh-Line. I don't think that it's narcissism. I think that you were raised with values by your parents that I think drive so much of your public service. And I personally feel with elected officials that one can become jaded with them, but I always think of you. I always think of your integrity and your desire to protect. I'm really proud of you. Thank you for sharing this story. In all the time that I've known you, it's been fascinating to hear all of these behind the scenes and anecdotes from Yuh-Line and Tony. I think other people will also see it as a teaching moment and hopefully inspire others from our community to run for office. So thank you all.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.